In 1943, an American fighter pilot vanished without a trace during World War II. For 70 years, the military told his family he was lost forever over the Pacific. But when his daughter uncovered his forgotten military footlocker, she found a classified flight map leading to an island he was never supposed to have seen. The trail ended at an unbelievable sight. 70 years later, his plane was found perfectly parked inside a giant sealed cave. But this was no accident. The plane was hidden. And the truth of what he was protecting was a secret so dark powerful forces would do anything to keep it buried. Why was a war hero sealed inside a mountain? And what was he hiding from the world? Subscribe. It helps these stories to reach people who lost hope and inspire them to keep seeking truth. And drop your city and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see our map light up. The dust in the attic wasn't just dust. It was the residue of a life, of two lives really. Hers and her late husband, David's. At 67, Eleanor Hayes felt every particle of it in her throat, a dry, chalky reminder of endings. The task was simple, brutal. Clear out the last remnants of their shared history from this rural Montana home before the new owners arrived. Each box she sealed felt like a miniature burial. She was methodical, a retired school librarian who found comfort in order. But there was no cataloging this kind of grief. You just had to breathe through it. Under a stack of David's old college textbooks, tucked away in the darkest corner beneath the eaves, was something that didn't belong to him. It was an Army-issue footlocker, olive drab and bound with steel, a single heavy padlock securing its secrets. It wasn't David's. He had served stateside during Vietnam, long after these were standard issue. A cold knot formed in her stomach. This had to belong to her father. Lieutenant Thomas Tommy Reed, a name that was more myth than man to her. He was the handsome, smiling ghost in a single sepia-toned photograph on her mother's bedside table, a pilot who had vanished over the Pacific in 1943 when Eleanor was just a baby. Her mother had spoken of him in hushed, reverent tones, always ending the story the same way: a storm, a lost transmission, a hero swallowed by the sea. The military had been kind, but firm. No wreckage, no trace. A tragedy, they'd called it, an acceptable loss in a world full of them. Eleanor found a crowbar in David's old tool chest, the weight of it unfamiliar in her hands. The lock was rusted solid, fused by 70 years of silent waiting. She wedged the tip into the clasp and leaned into it with all her weight. The metal screamed, a high, protesting shriek that echoed in the silent attic, and then it snapped. A wave of air, stale and ancient, washed over her, smelling of old paper, leather, and something else, something like hope. Inside, everything was perfectly preserved, as if sealed in a time capsule. On top lay a stack of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon, her father's handwriting, a strong, clean cursive she'd only ever seen on the back of that one photograph. She untied the ribbon with trembling fingers, her librarian's instinct to preserve warring with the desperate need of a daughter to know. The letters were to her mother, filled with the everyday details of a young man at war, complaints about the food, jokes about his bunkmates, and beneath it all, a current of deep, unwavering love for the wife and baby girl he'd left behind. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. For the first time he wasn't a myth, he was real, he was here. It was a moment of pure, unexpected grace, a connection across time that felt like a miracle. Beneath the letters was his folded flight map. She carefully unfolded the brittle paper, tracing the patrol routes marked in faint pencil over the vast blue emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. This was his world. This was where he'd been lost. But then she saw it. Tucked into the corner, almost hidden, was an official stamp she'd never seen before. A stark black eagle with its wings spread wide, and beneath it the word classified. Her breath caught. Next to it, in her father's own hand, was a set of coordinates, a location marked with a small, precise X. Her mind raced, trying to place it. She knew the official story by heart, the grid numbers the military had sent her mother in that final, terrible letter. This wasn't it. This location was hundreds of miles away from his supposed flight path, over a chain of volcanic islands the military had always insisted were of no strategic importance. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, began to replace the warmth of reading his letters. Why was this map here? Why was it marked classified? The story, the clean, tragic story she had carried with her for her entire life, suddenly felt thin, brittle, like it was about to shatter. The sharp ring of the telephone downstairs ripped through the quiet of the house, making her jump. She hurried down the attic ladder, her knees protesting, and snatched the receiver off the wall. It was her daughter, Sarah, her voice bright with excitement. "Mom, are you on your way? Michael's graduation starts in an hour. He's so nervous he's already asked about you 3 times." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. The graduation, her only grandson, she had promised. She looked from the phone in her hand to the map spread out on the kitchen table, the secret X staring up at her like an eye. The past and the present were pulling her in two, a sudden, violent schism in her world. "Sarah, honey," she began, her own voice sounding distant and strange. Something has come up." She tried to explain about the footlocker, the letters, the map, but the words felt clumsy, insane. How could she explain that a 70-year-old piece of paper felt more urgent, more real, than her grandson's milestone? "Mom, no." Sarah's voice lost its warmth, replaced by a familiar, weary frustration. "Not today, please. It's always something with the past, isn't it? It's Michael's day. He needs his grandma." Eleanor felt a chasm opening between them, wide and cold. In that moment, she made a choice. It wasn't a choice a good mother or a good grandmother would make. It was the choice of a daughter who had just found her father's ghost and couldn't bear to let him go. "I can't," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "I have to go to the county records office before they close. I need to look up these coordinates." There was a long, wounded silence on the other end of the line. Then Sarah's voice, sharp with betrayal. "You know what, Mom? Fine. Go chase your ghosts. But don't be surprised when you turn around and the living are gone too." The line went dead. Eleanor stood in the silent kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening. She had done it. She had wounded her own child, tarnished a day that was supposed to be pure joy, all for a mystery locked in a dead man's map. The pain of it was immense, a crushing weight of guilt and shame. This was the cost, then. This was the price of admission. She sank into a chair, her body trembling, the joy of her discovery completely erased by the agony of her choice. Was she losing her mind? Sacrificing her family for a 70-year-old ink mark? She felt a wave of despair wash over her, so powerful it almost made her pick up the phone and beg for forgiveness. But her eyes fell on the letters again. She picked up the last one her father had written, the paper so thin you could almost see through it. Her gaze fell upon a single line, underlined twice, as if he knew it was the most important thing he would ever write. "If they hide me, Sarah Jane," he had written to her mother, "tell them I stood for truth." The words weren't a sentiment, they were an order, a plea from across the decades. They were his last will and testament. And in that moment, the guilt in Eleanor's heart began to burn away, forged into something harder, something stronger. It became resolve. Her daughter might not understand. The world might call her a fool. But her father had asked for one thing, and she would not let him down. She would stand for truth, too. Eleanor folded the map, her hand steady now, and placed it carefully in her purse. The rift with her daughter was real, a fresh, gaping wound. But the mission was real, too. The official story was a lie. Her father had been hidden. Now she had to find out why. And she had to find out who they were. The flight from Montana to Washington, D.C. felt like a journey across more than just geography. It was a leap across a lifetime of accepted truths. Eleanor looked out the small airplane window at the patchwork of America below, the country her father had supposedly died to defend. The pain from her phone call with Sarah was a dull, constant ache behind her ribs, a reminder of the price she was already paying. She had left a message for her grandson, Michael, telling him how proud she was, how much she loved him, the words feeling hollow even as she spoke them. This trip, this quest, had better be worth it. Before she even hailed a cab from the airport, she sat on a hard plastic bench in the arrivals terminal and dialed the one number that felt like home. Marjorie Collins, her friend of 40 years, answered on the second ring, her voice as calm and steady as a lighthouse beam. "You made it then," Marjorie said, not a question but a statement of fact. Eleanor took a deep breath, the familiar sound of her friend's voice a balm on her frayed nerves. "I'm here, Marge, and I'm scared." She didn't have to pretend. With Marjorie, she never did. This was when the retired librarian became a strategist, and the retired nurse became her command center. They had planned this out over coffee the day before she left. "Okay," Marjorie said, the sound of a pen scratching on paper audible over the line. "Tell me the name of your hotel again. And the room number, when you get it. You'll call me tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, no matter what. If you don't call by 9:15, I'm calling the hotel. If they can't find you, I'm calling the D.C. police. Is that clear?" It was. This was Marjorie's way of loving someone, by building a fortress of procedure around them. They established a code phrase, a simple, innocuous line from a psalm they both loved. "He shall give his angels charge over thee." If Eleanor ever said that phrase in a message or a call, it meant she was in trouble, that she was being watched or coerced, and Marjorie was to immediately contact the authorities with all the information Eleanor had sent her. It felt dramatic, even foolish, sitting there in a bustling airport. But the classified stamp on the map, her father's desperate plea to tell them, it had planted a seed of real fear in her heart. This wasn't just a historical inquiry anymore. It felt like something else, something dangerous. After hanging up, Eleanor felt a sliver of her resolve return. She was not entirely alone. She had an anchor. The National Military Archives was a temple of stone and silence. Its marble halls and soaring ceilings were designed to make you feel small, insignificant in the face of such a vast organized history. In the main research room, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and floor wax. Whispers were the only accepted form of communication. For a moment, Eleanor felt a surge of hope, a librarian's faith in the power of the written record. The truth had to be in here, filed away in a box, waiting for someone with the right question. She was directed to the desk of Dr. Paul Keating, a man in his mid-50s with a kind, weary face and glasses that he was constantly, nervously polishing. He listened to her story with a patient, academic air, nodding slowly as she explained about the footlocker and her father, Lieutenant Thomas Reed. She made a calculated decision not to show him the map itself, a flicker of newfound caution telling her to hold her best card close. She simply gave him her father's name, his squadron, and the official date he was reported missing. "I'm just hoping to see the squadron's after-action reports," she said, her voice steady. "Or any mission logs from that period. The official letter my mother received was very brief." Dr. Keating gave her a sympathetic smile and tapped a few keys on his computer terminal. "Of course, Mrs. Hayes. It's an honor to help the family of a hero. Let me see what we have." He scrolled through screens of digital records, his brow furrowed in concentration. For a few minutes, Eleanor allowed herself to relax. This was right. This was how it was supposed to work. He was her guide, her ally in this temple of facts. Then his scrolling stopped. He leaned closer to the screen, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to something else. Something guarded. "That's odd," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He looked up at her, his eyes seeming to appraise her for the first time. "Mrs. Hayes," he said slowly, his voice now a register lower. "You're not the first person to inquire about this particular unit, not by a long shot." A chill snaked its way down Eleanor's spine. Before she could ask what he meant, a younger man in a crisp, dark suit appeared at Keating's elbow, whispering something in his ear that she couldn't hear. Keating's face lost what little color it had. He gave the man a curt nod, and the man retreated as silently as he had appeared. The friendly archivist was gone. In his place was a nervous bureaucrat. "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Hayes," Keating said, refusing to meet her gaze. He began polishing his glasses with a frantic energy. "It seems the files you've requested have just been pulled for archival review and recataloguing. It's a routine process. They'll be unavailable for an indefinite period." The words were so smooth, so practiced, so utterly unbelievable. An indefinite period. It was a door slamming shut, the lock turning. Desperation made her reckless. "Dr. Keating, please," she said, leaning forward. "My father wrote that if they hid him, we were supposed to tell the truth. Someone hid him." "I know they did." The moment she said it, she knew she had made a terrible mistake. The fear in Keating's eyes was unmistakable now. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly in the silent room. "I think you should go," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "My advice, as a historian and as a citizen, is to let sleeping ghosts lie. These men died for their country. Let them rest in peace." He turned away, a clear dismissal. The warmth and hope she had felt just minutes before curdled into a cold, sickening dread. The institution wasn't a temple of truth, it was a fortress, and the walls were closing in on her. She felt every eye in the room on her as she gathered her things, her hands shaking with a mixture of anger and humiliation. She stumbled out of the archives and into the blinding afternoon sun, the weight of her failure crushing her. Sarah had been right. She was a fool, chasing ghosts in a city that had perfected the art of burying them. The grand monuments of Washington no longer looked inspiring. They looked like tombstones, marking the death of ideals she once held dear. She was about to step off the curb to cross the street when a voice, low and urgent, spoke right beside her ear. "Mrs. Hayes, it was Keating." He stood so close she could feel the nervous energy radiating from him, his eyes darting around the crowded sidewalk. He didn't look at her. "They listen," he hissed, his gaze fixed on the traffic. "They always listen." Before she could process what he was saying, he pressed a small, hard object into her hand, his fingers cold and clammy. "Get out of the city. Don't trust anyone who claims to have the official record. The real record was never meant to be found." And then he was gone, swallowed by the river of tourists and government workers, leaving her standing on the corner, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked down at her palm. He had given her a single microfiche slide. She held it up to the graying sky. The image was grainy, a high-contrast photograph of what looked like a dark maw, a cave opening, surrounded by dense, unfamiliar jungle. And beneath the image, 2 words were typed in stark, military font. 2 words that meant nothing to her, but felt like the key to everything. Project Reliquary, 1943. The tiny microfiche slide felt heavier than a block of lead in Eleanor's pocket. Back in her quiet Montana house, the silence was no longer peaceful. It was menacing. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside the window, made her jump. Dr. Keating's warning, "They listen," echoed in her mind. Who were they? And how vast was their reach if they could make a man's entire military record vanish with a single phone call? The anger she had felt in Washington had cooled into a hard, cold resolve. She wouldn't be scared away. She was a librarian. Her entire life had been about finding the right reference, following the breadcrumbs. Project Reliquary was her new card catalog number. She spent 3 days in her home office, the blinds drawn, surrounded by maps and stacks of books on World War II's Pacific Theater. She drank endless cups of tea and ignored the ringing phone, knowing it was likely Sarah, a call she didn't have the strength to answer yet. She cross-referenced the coordinates from her father's map with declassified naval charts from the era. The island was a tiny, volcanic teardrop in a larger, mostly uninhabited archipelago, a place footnotes in history books dismissed as strategically worthless. But the real breakthrough came from a different kind of search. Digging into online historical forums and databases of Pacific ecological studies, she found a name that appeared again and again in connection to that specific island: James Tanaka, a park ranger and amateur historian, a 38-year-old man who had written several extensively researched articles about the island's unique ecosystem and the lingering relics of the war. A brief biography mentioned that his own Japanese-American grandfather had been stationed on a nearby supply base during the conflict. It was a long shot, a desperate grasp at a connection, but it was the only one she had. Her heart hammered as she found a number for the island's ranger station and dialed. The voice that answered was calm, measured, with a hint of weariness. She introduced herself, a retired librarian from Montana researching her father's service. The lie felt flimsy on her tongue. "I was told you were the expert on the island's history," she said, trying to keep her voice even. James Tanaka was polite but distant. "I know a bit," he said cautiously. "What exactly are you looking for, Mrs. Hayes?" She took a breath. "I'm looking for a cave." There was a long silence on the line, so long she thought he had hung up. "There are hundreds of caves on this island," he finally said, his voice flat. "Lava tubes, mostly. They're unstable." She pressed on, her voice dropping to a near whisper. This one had a name, Project Reliquary. The silence this time was different. It wasn't empty. It was charged, heavy with unspoken things. When he spoke again, all traces of politeness were gone, replaced by a sharp edge of warning. "Ma'am, I don't know where you heard that name, but that's not something you should be asking about. This is a protected environmental zone, not a place for treasure hunters." The accusation stung, but it also confirmed she was on the right track. This name meant something. "I am not a treasure hunter, Mr. Tanaka," she said, her own voice hardening with the steely persistence she had learned over a lifetime. "My father, Lieutenant Thomas Reed, vanished in 1943. The United States government lied to my mother about where he was. I have reason to believe he ended up on your island, and I am going to find out why." She didn't know if it was the conviction in her voice or the mention of her father's name, but something in his resolve seemed to crack. "My grandfather," he began, then stopped. "He used to fly supply runs in this sector. He mentioned things, stories the men told." He sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion that traveled across the thousands of miles between them. "Look, I can't officially help you, but if a team of accredited environmental surveyors were to say, 'Apply for a permit to study invasive plant species along the northern coast,' I would be assigned as their guide." It was an offer, wrapped in layers of plausible deniability. It was her only way in. "We'll be there in 2 weeks, Eleanor said, a surge of adrenaline washing away her fear. For the first time since leaving Washington, she felt a genuine, soaring sense of hope. She had an ally. The 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparations. Eleanor, ever the meticulous planner, liquidated a portion of her retirement savings, a decision that felt both reckless and necessary. She and James spoke every few days, finalizing their cover story. He sent her a list of equipment: satellite phone, personal locator beacons, signal flares. This was real now. The night before her flight, she called Marjorie, updating her on the new, far more dangerous plan. Marjorie was quiet for a long time. "Ellie," she finally said, her voice tight with worry, "this isn't a history project anymore. These are not good people you're messing with." "I know," Eleanor whispered, "but my father stood for truth, Marge. How can I not?" They renewed their safety protocols. She would share her GPS location with Marjorie at all times. They established a daily check-in via the satellite phone, a simple message: "The sky is clear," and if things went wrong, if she was in danger, the code phrase, "He shall give his angels charge over thee." Landing on the island was like stepping back in time. The air was a heavy, wet blanket, thick with the smell of salt and rot and blooming flowers she'd never seen before. The jungle was a wall of impossible green, alive with the screech of unseen birds and the hum of insects. The silence wasn't empty, it was heavy, filled with things unseen. James Tanaka was waiting for her, a quiet, lean man with watchful eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He carried a waterproof notebook and a GPS receiver and moved through the dense foliage with a practiced ease that made Eleanor feel every one of her 67 years. They established their buddy system immediately, a set of hand signals and a rule to never be more than 50 feet apart. He was professional, focused, but she could sense a deep well of conflict behind his calm exterior. As they hiked away from the small port town, deeper into the island's untamed interior, the sheer beauty of the place was overwhelming. Waterfalls cascaded down moss-covered cliffs into turquoise pools. Giant ferns created a canopy that dappled the jungle floor in an emerald light. It was a paradise, a place of stunning, raw life. It felt impossible that something so ugly could have happened here. Nature stood as a silent, powerful witness. On the third day, as they navigated a narrow coastal path choked with vines, James suddenly stopped. He pointed to the ground at the base of a giant banyan tree. There, half buried in the black, volcanic soil, was a piece of rusted metal. Eleanor knelt, her heart pounding, and carefully brushed the dirt away. It was a canteen, the old army issue kind, flattened and corroded by 70 years of tropical rain. A little farther on they found the brass buckle from a soldier's belt. Her breath caught in her throat. She reached out and touched the cold, pitted metal. It was proof. Tangible, physical proof. Her father, or men like him, had walked this very path. The ghost she had been chasing suddenly felt terrifyingly real. A wave of elation washed over her, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She looked at James, and he gave her a small, solemn nod. They were on the right trail. They were close. It was in this moment of triumph, this peak of hope, that the satellite phone in James's pack began to beep with an incoming message. He unclipped it, his brow furrowed as he read the small screen. His face went pale. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, the joy instantly draining out of her. He looked up at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. "It's from the governor's office," he said, his voice flat and dead. "Our survey permits have been revoked, effective immediately." Eleanor's mind reeled. Why? On what grounds? James stared out at the perfectly calm azure sea. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. He held up the phone for her to see the reason cited on the screen. Pending storm danger. The lie was so blatant, so insulting, it was like a slap in the face. They weren't being protected. They were being stopped. The invisible enemy had found them. And now, miles from civilization, with no official reason to be there, they weren't researchers anymore. They were trespassers. The jungle, which had felt like a witness just moments before, now felt like the walls of a cage. The hike back to the small port town was a forced march of grim silence. The elation they had felt just hours before had evaporated, leaving behind a bitter, metallic taste of fear. The blatant lie about a storm felt like a personal threat, a demonstration of power from an enemy who didn't even need to show their face. They were being watched, their movements anticipated. Eleanor felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her gut. She wasn't just searching for a piece of history, she was poking a sleeping dragon. James was quiet, his face a mask of controlled fury. This wasn't just a mission for him anymore. It was an attack on his home, his career, his very identity as a protector of this island. Back in the sparsely furnished room she'd rented above the town's only cafe, the humidity felt suffocating. They sat at a small, wobbly table, the artifacts they'd found, the rusted canteen, the brass buckle, sitting between them like sacred relics of a forbidden faith. "This has never happened before," James said, breaking the silence, his voice raw. "I've been a ranger here for 15 years. A permit has never been revoked like this. Not for any reason." The blatant abuse of power was a violation that sickened him. He had dedicated his life to a system of rules and respect, and that system had just been turned against him like a weapon. That evening, as the sun bled orange and purple streaks across the harbor, a man came to see them. He didn't knock. A young local boy simply appeared at the door and announced that someone was waiting for them on the veranda of the island's single colonial-era hotel. The invitation was not a request. The man was in his late 70s, with a full head of perfectly coiffed silver hair and the ramrod straight posture of a lifelong military officer. He was dressed in a crisp white linen suit that seemed immune to the tropical humidity. He rose as they approached, extending a hand to Eleanor with a smile that was all perfectly aligned teeth and no warmth. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. "A pleasure. I'm Colonel Victor Markham, retired. I'm the head of the Veterans Heritage Council. We work to preserve and protect sacred sites from our nation's history." He introduced himself as a guardian, a protector, an ally. But Eleanor felt a primal, instinctual revulsion. There was a predatory stillness about him, the coiled patience of a snake. The name of his council was a masterpiece of Orwellian doublespeak, using the very language of honor to mask its opposite. He gestured for them to sit, offering them iced tea from a sweating pitcher on the table. The entire scene was surreal, a civilized parlor meeting in the heart of a conspiracy. "I heard about the unfortunate bureaucratic mix-up with your permits," Markham said, his eyes twinkling with feigned sympathy. "Dreadful, isn't it? Local politics, always getting in the way, but perhaps it's for the best." He took a slow sip of his tea, his gaze never leaving Eleanor's. The Veterans Heritage Council has been aware of this island and its unique sensitivities for quite some time. We've worked very hard to ensure that the resting places of our fallen heroes are not disturbed by curiosity seekers or, forgive me, those with perhaps a misguided sense of personal connection. The condescension was breathtaking, a deliberate, calculated insult wrapped in the language of concern. He was dismissing her life's wound, her father's entire existence, as a petty personal matter. A hot flash of anger shot through Eleanor, so potent it made her hands tremble. She gripped the arms of her wicker chair to steady herself. James sat beside her, rigid with a fury he could not show, his knuckles white where he clutched his own glass. "So you're the one," Eleanor said, her voice surprisingly steady. "You had our permits revoked." Markham smiled again, a slight, indulgent tilt of his lips. "Let's just say I have friends in the local government who understand the importance of discretion. The work we do is about protecting the national narrative, Mrs. Hayes. Sometimes, for the greater good, certain footnotes of history are best left unread." He then turned his attention to her, offering a deal that was really a threat. "I understand your desire for closure," he said, his voice dripping with false empathy, "and I want to help you. Return home to Montana. Put all this unpleasantness behind you. In exchange, my council will release your father's complete, unredacted service record directly to you. Privately. You'll have the truth, and his honor will remain protected." It was the perfect temptation, the very thing she had come all this way for. For a split second, she felt a powerful pull to accept, to end this nightmare and go home to her daughter, to her life. She could have her answers without any more danger, without any more fighting. But then she remembered her father's words. "If they hide me, tell them I stood for truth." Markham wasn't offering truth. He was offering a tidy, sanitized, officially approved story, delivered in a sealed envelope. He was offering to buy her silence. "No," she said, the word coming out sharp and clear. "I'm not interested in your version of the truth." Markham's smile finally vanished. The mask of the charming heritage protector fell away, revealing the cold, ruthless operator beneath. It was then that she noticed it, a small, chilling tell. As his demeanor shifted, he unconsciously reached up and straightened his perfectly aligned cufflinks, a gesture of control, of reasserting his dominance. "That's a pity," he said, his voice turning to ice. "A real pity." He then delivered the line that would ignite in Eleanor a hatred so pure, so white, hot, that it would fuel her for the rest of her journey. He leaned forward, his voice a confidential murmur. "You must understand, Mrs. Hayes. In any great conflict, there are sacrifices. The men we lost, the missions that went sideways, and of course, the families they left behind, what you might call collateral families. All of them are, in the grand calculus of history, acceptable losses." Acceptable losses. The phrase hung in the humid air, obscene and monstrous. He had just reduced her entire life, her mother's lifetime of grief, her father's unknown sacrifice, to a mathematical rounding error. It was the most hateful thing she had ever heard. The man was a ghoul, polishing the tombstones of men he had helped to bury. The brief flicker of hope and peace she might have felt at his offer was utterly incinerated, replaced by a righteous, unyielding rage. They left the hotel, walking back through the darkening town in a stunned, furious silence. The trap had been sprung. He hadn't just warned them off. He had shown them the face of the enemy, and it was the face of absolute, soul-crushing indifference. They had barely made it back to their room when James's cell phone rang. It was his direct superior from the Parks Department. James listened, his face growing paler with each passing second. He hung up without saying a word. "What is it?" Eleanor whispered, though she already knew. "A formal complaint has been filed against me," he said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "For endangering a civilian researcher by willfully ignoring official storm warnings." He stared at her, his eyes wide with the shock of betrayal. "I've been suspended indefinitely, pending a full investigation." Markham was thorough. He hadn't just blocked their path. He had destroyed the career of the only man who could help her. He was salting the earth behind them, ensuring they had no support, no allies, no official standing. They were utterly, completely alone now. They were no longer just trespassers, they were outcasts on an island controlled by a monster. And somewhere out there, in the oppressive darkness of the jungle, her father's secret remained locked away, guarded by a man who believed that families, that people, that truth itself, were nothing more than acceptable losses. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on the humid air in the small room, making it hard to breathe. James sat staring at the wooden floorboards, the ruins of his 15-year career settling around him like dust. Markham's cruelty was tactical, precise. By suspending James, he hadn't just removed their guide, he had severed their last tie to legitimacy. They were no longer researchers. They were now officially a disgraced park ranger and a civilian meddler, isolated and vulnerable. Eleanor looked at the young man's face, etched with a pain and humiliation that felt achingly familiar. It was the same hollowed-out look she had seen in her own mirror for years, the look of someone whose foundational beliefs had been shattered by an indifferent and powerful authority. Markham hadn't just cost him his job, he had poisoned his sense of purpose. For a moment, she felt a crippling wave of guilt. She had brought this down on him. She was the one who had come here, stirring up the past, and he was paying the price. "James, I am so sorry," she whispered, the words inadequate. "You should leave. Go back to the mainland. Fight this. Don't let me destroy your life." It was a genuine offer, a release from the promise he had implicitly made to her. Part of her, the tired, frightened part, desperately hoped he would take it. James looked up, and the despair in his eyes was being burned away by something else. A cold, hard anger that mirrored her own. "Leave?" he said, his voice quiet, but sharp as broken glass. "Mrs. Hayes, this is my island. My grandfather's spirit is here. My whole life is here. That man, that monster in a white suit, he thinks he can just erase people, erase their histories, erase their careers. He thinks we're all just acceptable losses." He spat the phrase out like it was poison. "Well, I am not an acceptable loss, and neither was your father." In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted. He was no longer just a guide, and she was no longer just a client. They were allies, forged in the fire of a shared enemy's contempt. His pain had become his fuel. "He wants us to run," James continued, a strategic light coming back into his eyes. "So we're going to do the opposite." He walked over to a large topographical map of the island pinned to the wall. He was stripped of his official capacity, but he was still a ranger. This land was etched into his soul. "Markham thinks he's cut us off, but he's made a mistake. He thinks we needed the coastal trail, the easy way. He doesn't know the interior. I do." His finger traced a path over a steep green spine of mountains, a route that didn't appear on any official trail map. It was the old way, the path the island's first inhabitants had used. It was harder, more dangerous, but it was also invisible. A new, dangerous hope began to dawn in Eleanor's heart. It was a reckless, desperate plan, a decision born of fury and a refusal to be broken. It was also, she knew, exactly what Sarah would call chasing ghosts to her own doom. This was a choice that flew in the face of all reason. They were defying a powerful man who had already proven he could crush them without a second thought. But Markham's ultimate cruelty had backfired. By pushing them to the absolute brink, he had stripped away their fear of consequences. They had nothing left to lose. Before they left at dawn, under the cover of a thick pre-dawn mist, Eleanor took out her satellite phone. She typed out her daily check-in to Marjorie. "The sky is clear." But then she paused. She added a second line, one not in their plan. "Going off-grid for a few days. Don't worry. We'll contact when I can." It was a lie, a betrayal of the very safety system she had so carefully constructed. She knew if she told Marjorie the truth, that they were heading into the wilderness with no permits and a powerful enemy hunting them, Marjorie would have called the embassy, the State Department, anyone she could, and it would all be over. She was choosing her father's mystery over her own safety, over her promise to her friend. She was cutting her own safety line, and she knew it was a terrible, necessary mistake. The hike was brutal. The jungle interior was a primal world of clinging vines, sucking mud, and near-vertical ascents over slick, moss-covered rock. Eleanor's 67-year-old body screamed in protest. Her lungs burned, her muscles ached with a fire she hadn't felt in decades. But James was a master in this environment, showing her where to step, which vines were strong enough to hold her weight, how to read the subtle language of the forest. And with every painful step, Eleanor felt a strange sense of empowerment. She was no longer a retired librarian. She was a survivor, a fighter. This land wasn't just a place on a map anymore. She was earning her right to be here with blood, sweat, and sheer stubborn will. On the second day, James led them to a high ridge overlooking a valley. He pulled out her father's old flight map, the paper now soft and worn from handling. He aligned it with the landscape below, his finger tracing the margin notes, the faint pencil lines her father had drawn 70 years ago. "These aren't just patrol routes," he said, his voice filled with a new reverence. "They're landmarks." He was sketching the terrain from the air. And then he found it. Using a confluence of 3 volcanic peaks her father had sketched as a guide, he pointed to a sheer cliff face on the far side of the valley. "There," he breathed. "The coordinates from your father's map, that's where we have to go." It took them another full day to reach the base of the cliff. From a distance, it looked like an unbroken wall of limestone. But as they got closer, following a barely perceptible game trail, they saw it. Tucked behind a curtain of hanging vines, almost perfectly camouflaged, was the dark opening of a cave. It was exactly like the image on the microfiche slide. It was real. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like a drum against her ribs. 70 years, a lifetime of questions had led her to this exact spot. This was it. The entrance, however, was blocked. A massive, man-made steel door, thick and rusted, had been bolted into the rock face. It was a tomb. It had been sealed on purpose. A wave of despair washed over her. To have come all this way, to have sacrificed so much, only to be stopped by a slab of immovable metal. But James was already examining the edges of the door, running his hands over the rock around the frame. "This is old," he said. "World War II, era steel. But look." He pointed to a small niche carved into the rock just to the side of the door, a space barely big enough to fit a fist. It looked empty. But Eleanor, her librarian's eyes trained to see details others missed, saw a faint glint of metal deep inside the crevice. She reached into the niche, her fingers scraping against the rough stone, and pulled it out. It was a single, silver dog tag, hanging from a broken chain. It was tarnished and grimy, but the embossed lettering was still clear. "Reed, Thomas J." The name leaped out at her, a shout across the decades. Beneath it was his service number. Her father's dog tag. A sob escaped her lips, a raw, ragged sound. He had been here. He had stood on this very spot. And he had left this for them to find, wedged in the rock as if on purpose. It wasn't a grave marker. It was a signpost. It was a message. I was here. In that moment, holding the last thing her father had likely ever touched, she felt an overwhelming sense of connection, of victory. This single piece of metal was her proof, her justification for everything. But the triumph was fleeting, shattered by a sudden harsh sound from behind them, the crackle of a radio, the crunch of boots on rock. 2 men, dressed in modern tactical gear and carrying rifles, stepped out of the jungle onto the path. They weren't soldiers, they were private security, their faces hard and impassive. One of them raised his radio to his mouth. "Markham, we've got them," he said, his voice flat and professional. "At the cave entrance. Yeah, the woman is here too." They had been followed. Or worse, Markham had known all along where they were going. The whole trek had been a race, and they had just lost. The lead security guard stepped forward, his eyes cold and empty. "You're trespassing on restricted private property," he said, the words a rehearsed lie. "We'll have to ask you to hand over your gear and come with us." He gestured with his rifle, not at them, but at her hand. "And the dog tag, that's coming with us too." The elation of finding the dog tag evaporated into pure, cold dread. Eleanor's hand instinctively closed around the metal tag, her knuckles white. Giving it up felt like surrendering a piece of her father's soul. James stepped slightly in front of her, a protective gesture that was both brave and utterly futile. "You're not authorized to be here," he said, his voice low and shaking with rage. This is a protected national park zone. The lead guard let out a short, humorless laugh. Not anymore, it isn't. As of 2 hours ago, this entire valley was redesignated as private land, leased to a historical preservation society. The lie was so audacious, so complete, it was almost brilliant. Markham wasn't just breaking the rules, he was rewriting the rulebook in real time, using his influence to legally erase their right to even exist in this space. They had no authority, no recourse. They had been outmaneuvered at every turn. Defeated, they were marched back down the mountain, their confiscated gear, the map, the satellite phone, their GPS beacons, in a bag slung over one guard's shoulder. The final humiliation was being forced to hand over her father's dog tag. As Eleanor dropped it into the guard's outstretched palm, she felt a profound sense of failure, a cold emptiness that hollowed her out completely. They were escorted to a small, isolated fishing hut on a desolate stretch of coastline, miles from the main town. It was more of a shack than a house. A single room with 2 rickety cots and a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. "You'll be staying here until the next supply boat arrives in a few days," the guard said, his tone making it clear this wasn't for their comfort but for their containment. "Don't try to leave. The jungle is thick. You'll get lost." And then they were gone, leaving them locked inside, prisoners on an island where they no longer had any friends. The hope that had carried them through the brutal hike was gone, replaced by a suffocating despair. But even worse than the despair was the silence that now stretched between Eleanor and James. He sat on one cot, she on the other, the small room feeling like a vast, empty canyon. She kept replaying the events at the cave, the smug look on the guards' faces. How had they known? How had they found them so quickly in the middle of a dense, unmapped jungle? There was only one explanation. Just as the sun began to set, the sky outside turning a bruised purple, the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Within minutes it was a torrent, a tropical storm that had appeared out of nowhere. The wind howled, rattling the tin roof of the shack like a drum. The perfect sunny weather Markham's men had used as a lie to revoke their permits had been replaced by a genuine tempest. The irony was a cruel, bitter joke. The storm outside mirrored the one raging inside Eleanor. She looked at James, who was staring out the small, grimy window at the thrashing palm trees. And then, the words she had been holding back finally spilled out, poisoned with suspicion. "How did he know, James?" she asked, her voice quiet but heavy with accusation. "How did Markham know where to find us?" James turned from the window, his face unreadable in the dim light. "What are you saying?" he asked, though he knew exactly what she was saying. "He didn't know our route," she pressed, the pieces clicking into place with a sickening finality. "He just knew our destination. The only 2 people on this earth who knew about that cave were you and me, and he didn't hear it from me." The accusation hung in the air, thick and ugly. The trust they had forged, the alliance born of shared anger, shattered in an instant. James looked at her, his expression a mixture of hurt and something else she couldn't quite decipher, guilt. "My grandfather," he began, his voice barely a whisper. The stories he told. He didn't just fly supply runs in the sector, he flew supply runs for Project Reliquary. Eleanor felt the floor drop out from beneath her. It wasn't just a lead he had followed, it was a secret he had kept. All this time he knew more. He knew exactly what this place was, and he hadn't told her. The feeling of betrayal was absolute, a physical blow that took her breath away. "He knew more than he told me," James admitted, the shame evident in his voice. "He was just a kid, 18 years old, flying cargo planes. He didn't know what was in the crates, just that they were top secret, but he knew the name of the project, and he remembered the location because of the 3 mountain peaks. He made me promise I would never go looking for it. He said the men involved were not good men, and that some things were better left buried. He had protected his grandfather's memory over her father's truth. To him, it was a matter of honor, of keeping a promise to an old man haunted by his past. To her, in that moment, it was an unforgivable deception. He had let her risk everything, believing they were discovering this together, when all along he held the final piece of the map. The storm raged outside, the hut shaking with the force of the wind, and a new storm of rage and loneliness engulfed Eleanor. She was utterly alone, Her one ally now revealed as something else, something less trustworthy. She felt a desperate, primal need to connect with the outside world, with the one person she still trusted implicitly. While James was distracted by a particularly violent gust of wind that threatened to tear the roof off, she moved to her pack, which the guards had carelessly thrown in a corner. They had taken her satellite phone, but they hadn't been thorough. They had missed the small, personal locator beacon she kept tucked in a hidden side pocket. Her emergency lifeline. She fumbled with the device, her fingers clumsy with haste and fear. She couldn't make a call, but she could send a pre-programmed text message. Her hand hovered over the button for her standard, "I'm okay" message, but then her eyes filled with tears of rage and desperation. She had to tell Marjorie she was in trouble. This was the moment their safety protocol was designed for. She needed to send the code. She typed out the simple, powerful phrase, "He shall give his angels charge over thee." As her thumb pressed the send button, she felt a sliver of hope cut through her despair. Marjorie would get the message. Marjorie would act. Help was on the way. The message sent confirmation flashed on the tiny screen just as a board from the window was ripped away by the wind and the door to the hut burst open. It wasn't the wind, it was Markham's men. One of them strode in, his face grim, and his eyes immediately fell on the device in her hand. He lunged for it, but he was too late. He snatched it from her grasp and looked at the screen. "Damn it," he muttered, then turned to her, his eyes filled with a new kind of menace. They had underestimated her. And now, she had made a very powerful enemy, very, very angry. While one guard held them back, the other began methodically ransacking their things with a new urgency. He tore through their packs, dumping the contents onto the floor. And from a waterproof pouch in Eleanor's bag, he pulled out the single piece of evidence she had left. The microfiche slide. He held it up to the light of his flashlight, a small, triumphant smile on his lips. Then, he simply dropped it onto the wet floor and ground it into dust under the heel of his boot. Their only physical proof that Project Reliquary even existed was gone. The guards left them in the now damaged hut, the wind and rain whipping through the broken window. The loss of the microfiche was devastating. The betrayal she felt from James was a gaping wound. She had reached her lowest point, her nadir. Isolated, betrayed, all evidence destroyed. She curled up on the damp cot, shivering from cold and shock. She had lost. Markham had won. Just as that final, crushing thought settled in, a new sound cut through the storm. It was the whine of a powerful engine. Through the shattered window, she saw the lights of a large, official-looking boat arriving at the makeshift pier. A man in a crisp uniform disembarked, flanked by 2 local police officers. He was carrying a briefcase and a file. He wasn't here to rescue them. He was here to finalize their destruction. The man entered the hut, his face a mask of bureaucratic indifference. "Eleanor Hayes?" he asked, his voice cold and official. "I'm from the governor's office. Colonel Markham of the Veterans Heritage Council has filed a formal petition with my government and the U.S. Embassy. The petition is to have you deported immediately on suspicion of espionage against a sovereign nation." Espionage. The word was so absurd, so grotesquely out of place, that Eleanor almost laughed. A 67-year-old librarian from Montana, accused of being a spy. It was Markham's checkmate. He wasn't just silencing her, he was branding her, discrediting her so thoroughly that no one would ever listen to her story again. The official from the governor's office regarded her with the bored indifference of a man stamping paperwork, a cog in a machine she could never hope to fight. The local police officers stood by the door, their faces impassive, their allegiance clearly not with her. She was a foreign problem they had been ordered to remove. The betrayal she felt from James, the destruction of her evidence, the crushing weight of this final, legalistic blow, it was a perfect storm of despair. There was no escape. This was how it ended. Not with a bang, but with a deportation order signed in triplicate. As the officers stepped forward to escort her to the boat, a new voice cut through the howling of the wind, a voice so calm and steady it seemed to deflect the chaos around it. "She is a guest of the church. She is under our protection." Standing in the doorway, drenched from the storm but unmoved by it, was an old woman. She was tiny, her face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, and she wore the simple gray habit of a nun. She carried no weapon. She raised no voice, but her presence filled the small hut with an authority that made the armed men hesitate. The bureaucratic official turned, annoyance flickering across his face. "Sister Alima, this is official government business. You have no jurisdiction here." The old nun simply smiled, a gentle, knowing expression. "On this island, son, God's business always comes first, and this woman has come seeking sanctuary. You will not take her." There was no threat in her voice, only an unshakable statement of fact, as if she were commenting on the rain. It was a bluff, but it was a magnificent one. A moral stand so pure and absolute that the men, raised in a culture of deep respect for the church, faltered. They looked at each other, then back at the official, suddenly unsure of their orders in the face of this unexpected spiritual authority. The official, flustered and out of his depth, finally sputtered, "This is not over," before turning and marching back to his boat, his entourage trailing behind him like scolded children. The immediate threat was gone. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rain and Eleanor's own ragged breathing. Sister Alima turned to Eleanor, her dark, intelligent eyes filled with a compassion that was so profound it almost brought Eleanor to her knees. "Come, child," she said, her voice soft. "You will be safe with us." With nowhere else to go, Eleanor and James followed her through the storm to the old mission church that stood on a hill overlooking the town. It was a simple, whitewashed building of stone and dark wood, a steadfast sanctuary that had weathered 100 years of storms just like this one. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of beeswax and old hymnals. It was a place of peace, a world away from Markham's web of lies and violence. In a small room behind the altar, Sister Alima gave them dry clothes and hot, sweet tea. Eleanor's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the cup. She had been saved, plucked from the jaws of defeat by the most unexpected of allies. She looked at this tiny, ancient woman who had faced down armed men with nothing but her faith. "Why?" Eleanor asked, her voice cracking. "Why did you help us?" Sister Alima sat down opposite her, her gaze direct and searching. "Because I was there," she said simply. "I was a girl, just 9 years old in 1943. I saw them. I saw the American pilots they brought to the cave. The world stopped spinning. The storm, the deportation, the betrayal, it all faded away. Here, in this quiet, holy place, was the one thing Eleanor had almost given up on finding, a living witness. They told the village it was a quarantine station," Sister Alima continued, her mind drifting back 70 years. "For a new kind of fever. They said the pilots were sick, and that we must not go near the ridge, or we would get sick too. They used our fear to keep us away. But we knew it was a lie." She explained how her father, the village elder, had been pressured into silence, threatened by the American officers who came and went in the night. The community, the very people who should have been allies, had been turned into unwilling accomplices through intimidation, forced to become the guardians of a secret they didn't understand. The enemy she had imagined was a faceless institution, but now she saw its true shape. It was the casual cruelty of powerful men who used fear to manipulate and control the innocent. The pressure Markham exerted was not new. It was a ghost of a much older, uglier tactic. "But I watched," Sister Alima said, her eyes alight with the memory of a curious, defiant child. "I would hide in the jungle and watch the trucks go up the mountain. I saw the fear in the young pilots' faces, not a fear of sickness. It was something else. A deep, righteous anger, dormant for 7 decades, stirred in the old nun's heart. They were using our home for something wicked. We knew it in our bones. Over the years, a few of the local boys who worked at the supply base had whispered names to her, names of the pilots they had seen, names they were never supposed to repeat. And Sister Alima, even as a girl, knew the importance of bearing witness. She had started a ledger. For 70 years, hidden beneath a loose floorboard under the main altar, she had kept a record. A simple school notebook filled with the names, and sometimes the hometowns, of the men who had been taken to Project Reliquary. "Your father," she said, her voice dropping as she saw the look on Eleanor's face. "He was different. The others were scared. He was angry. He argued with the officers. I saw it. He refused to do something they wanted." The breath caught in Eleanor's throat. Her father wasn't just a victim. He was a dissident. He had stood for truth, even then, even there. The moral clarity of it, the sudden, fierce pride that swelled in her chest, was a feeling more powerful than any despair. She wasn't just clearing his name, she was honoring his courage. Just as this wave of triumphant understanding washed over her, the church's old iron bell began to toll, a deep, mournful sound that had nothing to do with the hour. A young boy from the village burst into the room, his eyes wide with fear, and spoke rapidly to Sister Alima in the local dialect. Her face grew grim. She turned to Eleanor. "They are starting," she said, her voice heavy. "The government has just announced its plans for a new deep-water harbor. They are going to expand the port to bring in more tourist ships." Eleanor didn't understand what that had to do with them, until Sister Alima delivered the final, devastating blow. To create the harbor, they need to clear the northern ridge. They are going to dynamite the entire cliff face where the cave island. She looked at a calendar on the wall. The demolition is scheduled to begin in 3 days. The victory of finding a witness was immediately erased by the ticking clock of a final, irreversible defeat. Markham wasn't just trying to deport her anymore. He was going to literally blow the secret off the face of the earth, burying her father's tomb, his plane, his story, under 1,000,000 tons of rock. It was the perfect permanent cover-up. 3 days. 72 hours. The words echoed in the sanctuary, a death sentence for the truth. Markham's plan was diabolical in its simplicity. He wasn't just erasing evidence, he was using the banner of public progress, a new harbor, more tourism, a better economy for the island, to do it. He was a master of turning evil into civic virtue. For a full minute, no one in the small room spoke. The weight of the deadline was crushing, a physical pressure that stole the air from their lungs. Defeat, absolute and final, felt inevitable. It was James who broke the silence, his voice raw with a pain that went deeper than just his suspended career. "My grandfather helped them," he said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "He flew the supplies. He was a part of this. He helped them seal that place up, and he spent the rest of his life trying to forget it." He finally looked at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a desperate need for her to understand. "When I kept his secret, I wasn't betraying you. I was trying to protect him, his memory. But I was wrong. His confession was not an excuse, but a reckoning. In trying to honor one man's shame, he had nearly helped bury another man's courage. The quiet, simmering rage that had fueled him was gone, replaced by a deep, clarifying resolve. "We are not letting them win," he said. "We are getting into that cave." It was an impossible plan. They had no tools, no permits, and no time. Markham's security would be swarming the ridge, and the demolition crews would be setting up their equipment. It was a suicide mission. But sitting in that quiet church, surrounded by the weight of 70 years of secrets, it felt like the only choice they had. Sister Alima, who had watched empires rise and fall from this small island, nodded slowly. "There are other ways up the mountain," she said, her voice a calm anchor in their storm of desperation. "Ways that only the old families know. And the door, it is old steel, but the hinges are its weakness. A carjack and a crowbar used with patience can do what a fist cannot." Hope, fragile and utterly insane, began to flicker in the room again. Their mission now had 3 components: a guide, a key, and a witness. They spent the next 24 hours gathering what they needed. James, using his knowledge of the local families who still harbored resentment against the military's wartime occupation, procured the tools they needed from an old fisherman's shed. Sister Alima gave Eleanor a small, ancient cell phone, charged and ready. "The signal is weak on the mountain," she warned, "but at the highest point of the ridge, sometimes you can reach the outside world." Eleanor knew who she had to call. She sent a single coded text message to Marjorie. "Prepare for a live broadcast. 4 a.m., my time, day after tomorrow. I will send a link." It was an incredible risk. It depended on a weak signal, a 70-year-old battery, and a prayer. But it was their only insurance policy. If Markham was going to bury the truth, they would make sure the whole world was watching when he did it. The ascent was even more treacherous than the first. Under the cover of a moonless night, Sister Alima led them along a nearly invisible goat track that clung to the sheer side of the mountain. At 80 years old, she moved with a slow, deliberate grace that put them to shame. She was the living memory of this land, and she was guiding them home. They reached the cave entrance an hour before dawn, their bodies aching, their clothes torn. As they had feared, 2 of Markham's security guards were stationed at the base of the trail. But they were watching the path they had used before, the official way. From their perch high on the cliffside, Eleanor, James, and Sister Alema were invisible ghosts. Working in the pre-dawn gloom, James wedged the crowbar into the seam of the great steel door, right at the top hinge. The 70-year-old metal groaned in protest. Using a rock as a hammer, he drove the crowbar deeper. It was slow, agonizing work. Every screech of the metal sounded like a gunshot in the silent jungle. Eleanor's job was to watch, her heart pounding with every strike. With each passing minute, the sky grew lighter, shifting from black to a deep indigo. Their time was running out. Finally, with a shriek of tortured metal, the top hinge snapped. Then the bottom. The great door, which had held its secret for a lifetime, sagged forward, held only by the rusted lock. With one final coordinated push, they forced it open just enough to squeeze through. The air that rushed out was cold and utterly still, untouched for 7 decades. It smelled of oil, metal, and dust. Inside, their flashlights cut through an absolute perfect darkness, and there it was. Preserved as if in a museum, sitting silently in the center of the vast limestone cavern, was a World War II fighter plane. It was perfect. The paint was unscratched, the glass of the cockpit was clear. It was her father's plane, parked neatly, as if he had just stepped out for a moment and was about to return. It was a ghost ship, a time capsule, a tomb. Awe and a profound, bone-deep sadness washed over Eleanor. He had landed it here. He had chosen this. She ran her hand along the cold metal wing, half expecting to feel the touch of his hand in return. James, his face a mask of reverence and regret, walked slowly around the aircraft. But it was what lay on the ground beside the cockpit that stole the breath from their lungs. On a small, overturned crate sat an old, primitive recording device, the kind that etched sound onto a wax cylinder, and beside it, a single, perfectly preserved cylinder. His final testimony, his farewell. Just as Eleanor reached for it, a beam of light sliced through the darkness from the cave entrance. "Don't touch that." It was Colonel Markham. He stood there, flanked by his 2 guards, his white suit pristine even here, his face a mask of cold fury. He had found them. "It's over, Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice echoing in the vast, silent space. "You've seen your family heirloom. Now you will leave, and you will forget you were ever here." But Eleanor wasn't the same woman who had met him on the hotel veranda. She had fought her way up this mountain, she had faced down his threats, and she had found her father. She had nothing left to fear from this small, hateful man. She looked at him, then picked up the wax cylinder. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I don't think I will." She saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. He had assumed she was broken, defeated. He had miscalculated. In that split second, she knew what she had to do. With a defiant cry, she turned and scrambled into the cockpit of the plane, slamming the canopy shut and locking it from the inside. She was sealed inside her father's tomb with his final words. Through the thick glass, she saw James and Sister Alema move to stand in front of the cave entrance, blocking Markham's path. The storm that had been brewing outside had finally broken, and a surge of seawater, driven by the wind, began to pour into the lower parts of the cave. Water was rising around Markham's feet. Chaos had erupted. But inside the cockpit, Eleanor felt a strange, profound calm. She took out the small cell phone Sister Alema had given her. Holding it up to the canopy, she found a single wavering bar of signal. Her hands trembling, she navigated to the phone's live streaming app and hit the button to go live, sending the link directly to Marjorie's waiting inbox in Montana. She placed the phone on the dashboard, aimed at the wax cylinder player, and then, with the world watching, she placed her father's last message onto the machine and gently, carefully, lowered the needle. The last line of defense was no longer a gun or a door. It was a live broadcast. And as Markham's men began to ram the canopy, trying to shatter the glass, her father's voice, preserved for 70 years, began to speak from the darkness. The first sound from the wax cylinder was the hiss of 70 years of silence. Then, a voice. Not the myth, not the ghost from the photograph, but a man. Young, clear, and filled with a resolve that echoed his daughter's own. "My name is Lieutenant Thomas Reed," he began, his voice steady despite the faint crackle of the recording. "If you are hearing this, it means I have failed, and it means my country has failed." Outside the cockpit, the pounding of Markham's men against the glass was a frantic, percussive rhythm. The rising storm surge roared into the cave, swirling around their ankles. But inside the plane there was only her father's voice. He explained everything. Project Reliquary wasn't a quarantine. It was a weapons experiment of the most depraved kind, a plan to test a new biological agent on an unsuspecting, isolated population, the very people of this island. He and a handful of other pilots who had discovered the truth had been given a monstrous choice: fly the mission and become war criminals, or be silenced, permanently. "They thought we were just boys who followed orders," he said, a note of bitter irony in his voice. "They didn't realize some of us still believed in the ideals we were fighting for." His plan had been desperate, a final act of moral defiance. He had volunteered for a reconnaissance flight, faked an engine malfunction, and brought his plane down here, in this pre-scouted cave. Before he sealed the entrance from the inside, a feat of engineering, he explained, in brief, technical detail, he had recorded this testimony. "I am sealing this place," his voice concluded, "to prevent this weapon from ever being used. I am entombing myself and my aircraft to protect the innocent. I don't know if this recording will ever be found. But if it is, know that we did not die for nothing. We died for what was right." He ended with a quiet, personal message, his voice finally breaking. "Sarah, Jane, my love, kiss our baby girl for me. Tell her, her father stood for truth." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face, hot and cleansing. It was all there. The truth, the sacrifice, the love. It was more than she had ever hoped for. Just as his voice faded, the cockpit glass finally spiderwebbed under a heavy blow. At the same moment, the small phone on the dashboard beeped, its battery finally dying. The broadcast was over. Markham, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage, gestured for his men to pull her out. But it was too late. At the mouth of the cave, James was holding up his own phone. He had been recording, too. Not the audio, but the scene itself. Markham and his hired thugs attempting to break into a war hero's tomb, threatening an old woman and an unarmed civilian, all while the hero's final, damning words echoed around them. And on his screen, live comments were pouring in from around the world. Marjorie had done her job. The live feed had been shared, reshared, picked up by news bloggers and independent journalists. The secret wasn't just out. It was viral. The truth, once a whisper, was now a global roar. Markham looked from the phone in James's hand to the shattered canopy, and for the first time, Eleanor saw the cold confidence in his eyes crumble into raw animal fear. He was no longer the master of the narrative. He was just a criminal, caught in the act. The aftermath was a whirlwind of international headlines. The story of the pilot who sealed himself in a cave to stop a war crime was too powerful, too cinematic to be ignored. Faced with the undeniable proof of the live stream and the physical evidence of the plane and the recording, the government had no choice. The demolition was halted. An official investigation was launched. Colonel Victor Markham was indicted for obstruction of justice, intimidation of witnesses, and a host of other charges related to his decades-long, self-appointed role as a cleaner of the military's dirtiest secrets. The cave was declared a protected historical site, a memorial to Lieutenant Thomas Reed and the other pilots Sister Alma had named in her ledger. 6 months later, Eleanor stood on the stage of a grand hall in Washington, D.C., the air thick with dress uniforms and the solemn weight of history. James, his Ranger credentials fully restored and a commendation for bravery on his record, stood in the front row beside a proud Sister Alma. On behalf of her father, Eleanor accepted a posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. The official narrative had been corrected. The truth, at last, had won. Justice had been served. It was a perfect, triumphant ending. But life is not a movie. It's messier. Victory has a cost. And for Eleanor, the price was steep. Her daughter, Sarah, was in the audience that day. But she sat several rows back, a palpable distance between them that was more than just physical. The global headlines and her mother's sudden fame had not healed the wound from that first terrible phone call. It had deepened it. "You did it, Mom," Sarah said to her afterwards, her voice polite but cool. "You saved him. You saved the father you never knew." The unspoken words hung in the air between them. But what about us? To Sarah, Eleanor had chosen the past over the present, a ghost over her own living family. She had missed her grandson's graduation. She had ignored frantic phone calls. She had vanished into a dangerous obsession without a thought for those who loved her, who worried for her. The truth had been revealed, but in the process, the simple, everyday trust that bound a mother and daughter together had been permanently scarred. It wasn't broken, but it would never be the same. The triumph of her quest was forever tangled with the quiet, lingering grief of that personal loss. It was a bittersweet victory, the kind that settles deep in your bones and stays there. A year later, Eleanor stood with her grandson, Michael, now a high school graduate with his grandfather's thoughtful eyes, at the newly dedicated memorial on the island. The cave entrance was now protected by a simple, elegant barrier, and a plaque told the story of Project Reliquary and the pilot who had sacrificed himself to stop it. The island's new harbor had been built, but on the opposite side of the island, a quiet victory for both history and nature. James was now the head of the island's national park, his life's work vindicated. He greeted them with a warm, easy smile, the friendship between him and Eleanor now a quiet, unbreakable bond. She and Michael walked to the edge of the cliff overlooking the sea, the same view her father must have seen on his last day. She took a small, portable audio player from her bag. It contained a clean, digitized copy of the wax cylinder recording. She didn't play the part about the weapon or the cover-up. She just played the last few seconds. His final prayer. "Sarah, Jane, my love, kiss our baby girl for me. Tell her, her father stood for truth." Michael squeezed his grandmother's hand. He hadn't just learned a story about a war hero. He had learned a lesson about integrity, about the cost of standing for what is right, a lesson passed down from a great-grandfather he would never meet, through the stubborn, relentless love of the woman standing beside him. Eleanor looked out at the vast, blue horizon, the same one that had swallowed her father's official story all those years ago. There was still a quiet ache for the relationship with her daughter, a scar that would likely never fade. But as the Pacific wind whipped through her silver hair, she also felt a profound sense of peace, a peace earned through courage and sacrifice. She had kept her promise, she had told them. And the voice of truth, captured on a fragile wax cylinder turning slowly in the sun, had finally outlasted the silence.